Hello and welcome back to another IB history video. Yay! We are still on our quest to learn all about the 20th century wars, their causes and effects. And today that is going to entail talking about the Falklands / the Marvinas War. Am I saying either of those two words right? No. But that's what we're going to do anyways. Alright, so without further ado, here is our timeline. Great. If you need more time, go back and pause. And we are going to start right off by talking about the causes. So, again, starting out with the long-term causes. I'm reading from my notes. That's what I'm looking at down there. Our long-term causes are going to be the weird occupation history that many countries had in the Falklands / the Marvinas. I'm going to go between the two terms. They mean the same place. We'll get there in a minute. So, there was a time when Britain, Spain, and France all occupied the Falklands. None of them really enjoyed it. I'm guessing it was just like a bad situation economically. It wasn't a great climate or whatever, but they were all there. And so, because none of them really liked it, Argentina got their independence from Spain in 1816. So this is a while back before before we really start talking about the 20th century stuff. Argentina took it over, renamed it to the Marvinas, but Britain didn't like that. Britain saw Argentina taking over land and thought, you're too little, you can't take over stuff, you can't take over our land. And so naturally they got upset. And so a small British force reasserted control there in 1833. So again, they got their independence in 1816. A small British force retook over that land in 1833, and they stayed there. Though Argentina really never relinquished its claims on the lands, they were both kind of occupying at the same time, which always gets messy. So, our vocab word is going to be junta. A junta is going to be a committee or council that rules a country, often applies to military rulers of Latin American countries, okay? So will you need to use this on your exam, that word? Not necessarily, as long as you have the concept, you know what you're talking about, but I'm going to use the word junta. So it again is referring to a committee or a council, so a group of people that are ruling a country, usually military rulers in Latin America. So a very unpopular junta was ruling over Argentina for a while. They were oppressive, they were authoritarian, and nobody liked them. So because of this social pressure to try and figure it out, whatever's happening in the Marvinas, there was also an economic crisis happening where the junta wanted a quick patriotic war to stabilize the country and try and fix Argentina, essentially. So at this point, we have the Antarctic Treaty that's keeping the Antarctic demilitarized, which is fine. But because of this Antarctic Treaty that's keeping the Antarctic demilitarized, because the Marvinas were in this kind of South Atlantic region, I'll put a picture here, because they were in this South Atlantic region, they were very important to Argentina to keep hold of because they wanted to control the South Atlantic, similar to what's happening in Britain where they're controlling these small islands and kind of controlling all the area around. They wanted to do something very similar. So that leads to privatization, which is the economic practice of selling government assets to private owners. It always leads to unemployment, and guess what? It led to unemployment. Shocker! So Britain ended up reducing its military size and had to reevaluate what it wanted to protect because it had just went through this period of privatization where now everybody doesn't have a job and it's kind of like this economic crisis and everything's bad. Britain has to take a step back and say, whoa, we're spending a lot of money on a lot of stuff that we do not need. What don't we need? And so they wanted to make a peaceful situation to the Falklands, Marvinas situation. But Argentina didn't want that, so they initiated conflict with Britain. So that brings us to the short term. Short term, negotiations started breaking down again in early 1982. So we've had this long period where it's like weird there, and now negotiations are really starting to break down. One member of the junta was anti-leftist, liked Reagan, who didn't abandon Britain. It was like very weird. Argentina was preparing for war at this point in secret. This is a tie that is very similar to the Algerian War, where we had one side that was preparing for war in secret before it actually happened, which is, of course, pretty common. But still, in this case, both sides that did this were the smaller side. It was the smaller side that was initiating the conflict. Argentina had a dispute in South Georgia, which is a country. We're not talking about the state. We're not talking about the south of Georgia. We're talking about South Georgia. And this conflict they used as the beginning of a war, because they kind of placed a flag on the land in South Georgia. And so Britain kind of failed to defuse the situation. And so there was just a lot of, it was weird on both sides. On both sides, nobody really knew what was going on. All they knew is that it did lead to war. So that brings us to the combatants, which, of course, as we've talked about, is going to be Great Britain versus Argentina. So for Great Britain, we had a country that was decreasing in size due to deprivatization and unemployment, and so they had been reducing their Royal Navy. They had less people in the military. And when this war started with Argentina, they did stop decreasing the size of their Royal Navy in specific. They stopped doing that. They had more advanced technology, more advanced ships, and they had United States support. But they were disadvantaged in their air force, in that they were limited to carrying by sea because they were not good at their air situation. So when they set up a blockade around of the area, the Maritime Exclusion Zone, MEZ, it considered any Argentine military vessel in the area as a target, and kind of eventually changed from this maritime exclusion zone to a total exclusion zone where anyone in the area without permission was a target. So it really ramped up. And then they did do some bombings with the help of the United States. Argentina, on the other side, had a navy who could operate on land, sea, and air. So they had like this weird navy situation where the navy was doing everything. They had a very strong air force and they had missiles, but they were limited in their weapons and ammunition because the United States was taking the side of Britain, and so they weren't giving them those resources anymore. So, as we previously said, Argentina is the one who had done the beginning of the war. They're the ones who kicked everything off. And originally, they just wanted to have a very short war. They wanted to use the South American winter to drive the British out and launch their operations so that they had that to aid them. But instead of doing that, they launched their operations too early, and they weren't really done preparing because they had, I assume, planned to launch this operation later, but then when the South Georgia thing happened, they launched it anyways. And so they weren't really done preparing. They weren't hitting this mark of the winter, which is what they wanted to do. And so they ended up deciding to do air attacks on British boats to try and even the playing field. In their minds, even the playing field. They just, at this point, wanted to make the war longer and force withdrawal, which is very similar to what happened in Algeria. All right, so let's go through a few of the most important events of the war, okay? So, Operation Rosario. Am I saying that right? No. Rosario. Argentina began reinforcing themselves on the islands because they, of course, have already kind of staked their claim there. They are the ones defending the territory. It only took 2 days for the British to send out forces. And so the British immediately started beginning intervention tactics. That was not working. So what ended up happening is it turned into a very diplomatic war. This war could even be considered like the main failure of diplomacy. And that's something we can kind of talk about in relation to this war. So the first situation in which we have a diplomatic failure is what I'm going to be calling the diplomatic rounds. And Britain won because of the passing of Resolution 502, which basically said that Britain was in the right and Argentina was wrong. However, Argentina won round 2 when they got a resolution with the OAS under Rio Pact, saying that they were in the right. So really everybody was kind of caught in the middle. It was very confusing. And one of the things that I think is consistent and sad and hilarious about the United States in these types of conflicts is that they usually try and step in and fix the problem, and it pretty much never works. And they did, and it didn't. So let's talk about the air war that we had going on at this point. So Britain was launching air attacks on Algerian defenders by using their Royal Navy to torpedo like cruisers. Very strange. This torpedo in specific on this Algerian cruiser was a topic of debate after the end of the war. And it is at this point when the negotiations fail. Like that's it. We're going to war. So let's talk about the operations on the island. So British, they got their surprise. Yay, British was surprising. And Algerian air attacks were repulsed at the cost of some of their ships. And Britain was able to move inland, which gave them the strength to cause Argentina's surrender. So let's just do a very brief recap of what just happened. So there's a situation, there's a skirmish. Argentina thinks, I want to prolong this war and I want to make them quit. But because they are so underdeveloped, they really don't have any help. They're kind of like losing on the side of diplomacy. And they end up being surprised by the British coming over. There is like a torpedo situation. And then Britain is able to come in and win because they caused them to surrender by moving inland onto their territory. So let's briefly talk about the effects. So as I'm sure you gathered, it was a pretty short war. So there were 746 dead and about 1,200 wounded. More than half of the dead were lost at sea from that torpedo incident. So really not a whole lot of land fighting in the grand scheme of things. It was more the air fight and then the torpedo situation. That was for Argentina. The British had less dead, only 250, but it cost them like over $1 billion. Ooh. What happened was the military junta ended up resigning, obviously, because that wasn't great. For a military junta, it was not very strong. And so that led to a spiral of kind of political instability in Argentina because we had the loss of this military junta who, mind you, was not very good, but he was there. So and there was already kind of a bad economic situation in Argentina, and this really just made it worse. It didn't help anything. But Britain got a political boost because they had a good reputation from it. And a new air base was built. So that's really the war. Pretty short, pretty simple. Again, now that you know about this, try and go find some questions. Try and make connections in your mind to the Algerian War, which is the other video I've uploaded. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. All right.